if you haven't already done so, take your Bibles and turn to 1 Samuel. And as I mentioned last night, this series of studies is really going to be a study through 1 Samuel very quickly, but hopefully with some good lessons that the Lord has revealed for us in this book. Hopefully those are shared as we spend time together. Last night we talked about how the Lord, I think I'll go ahead and flip that off. Last night we talked about how the Lord does whatever is good to Him. We may think to ourselves, if I were God, I would not do this or that. But as Hannah says in her prayer in chapter 2 and verse 3 of this book, she said, "Talk no more so very proudly, let no arrogance come from your mouth, because God is a God of knowledge. God is a God of all power, and God is a God of all holiness and goodness." And we saw many examples last night of how God does things in ways that we might not think that He would, but He is always working towards what is good. And when we learn to trust that what God does is really good and for the best, then like Hannah, she mentions at the beginning of that prayer, we will rejoice and we will smile and learn to wait on the Lord even when times are very difficult. When we left off last night, we were about in chapter 7. And just before chapter 7, really starting in chapter 4 and going up to 7, we read about how God had allowed Israel to suffer a great defeat in battle to the Philistines because they had not been trusting in Him. In fact, in chapter 7, we see that the Israelites had been holding on to idols, false gods, in addition to Jehovah. And in chapter 2, we saw how the priests and the leaders were not being very faithful to God. They were not keeping His laws. But even in the midst of this wickedness, Israel thought that God would defeat the Philistines for them anyway. So in chapter 4, when they lost a battle, the reaction in verse 3 was, why would God allow us to be defeated in battle? And they then said, well, we know what we will do. We will take the special box that God commanded us to create, the Ark of the Covenant. We will take it into the battle, and it will save us from the hands of our enemies. Their response was not to cry out to the Lord to ask Him to save them. Their response would be to grab the box, and it would be the means whereby they would be saved. Think about that. Essentially what the Israelites were doing was thinking to themselves, the way to be saved is not what the Lord had in mind, but it's rather a new technique that they thought that they could bring to the battle, whereby if they just used that technique, it would all work. What we saw last night when they took the ark into battle, what happened? A worse defeat. Many were killed. The ark was stolen. The priests were killed, Hophni and Phinehas. During the period that takes place between chapters 5 and 6, they saw that God was really still in control. The Philistines were troubled greatly by God as the ark was in their land. And when they returned the ark to the Israelites knew and understood they had not been humble to God. And so we saw, and this is where we left off in chapter 7 and verse 3, Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve Him only, and He will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. And so the children of Israel did put away the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and serve the Lord only. And Samuel in the next verse says, gather, I will pray to God for you. In verses 7 to 12 of this chapter, the Philistines come back. They're ready to fight Israel again. And I want you to see what it says beginning in verse 7. It says, the Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered together at Mizpah. The lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the children of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. This time, verse 8, The children of Israel said to Samuel, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that He may save us from the hand of the Philistines." And so Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Now, as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a loud thunder upon the Philistines that day, and so confused them that they were overcome before Israel. And as you read the next verse, you realize Israel took the victory. How were the Israelites saved? How were they delivered? It was by God. Interestingly, how did God do that? It says by a overwhelming thunder that happened in verse 10. Keep your finger here. Go back to chapter 2 in Hannah's prayer. It's very interesting that in her prayer in verse 10, it says, "The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven He will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth." I don't know that Hannah knew exactly what her words were going to mean one day, but indeed God thundered and brought the deliverance to Israel. Verses 13 through 17 say that there was peace, and that the Lord's hand, in verse 13, was against the Philistines all of Samuel's life, and Samuel judged Israel, and they recovered their territory, and all was well. Right? Israel's learned their lesson. Right? God has delivered His people, and we know it now. It was not a wrong technique. It was their dependence on God that had been wrong. Now they've learned that lesson, and we can stand and sing in the lessons now. On chapter 8, we read in verse 1 that it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But, verse 3, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." What's happened? Sometime later, from chapter 7, Samuel's very old at this point. His sons are not living correctly. Right? Samuel was a good man from all that we know of him. Sometimes children that then take responsibility for their own lives make ungodly choices. And that's what's happened here. All the elders of Israel come to Samuel and say, "Samuel, your sons are not walking in the ways of the Lord. They're not walking in your ways. And if this continues, we're in danger of the Lord not walking with us. So Samuel, what does the Lord want us to do? Samuel, please pray to the Lord for us, as you did before the battle with the Philistines, and ask Him what we shall do. It's God who delivers us." Is that what they say? That is not what they say to Samuel. It's what they should have done. They should have said, "Samuel, as you did before, cry out to the Lord. Ask Him what it is we must do. What is the word from the Lord?" But that is not their answer to this trouble. Their answer is, "We know what to do. Our technique is wrong. Our political system is wrong." Heard that before, right? That's what will save us. We need to change our political system. We need a king. We need a king like all the other nations. We need a king to judge us. Look at verse 19 of the chapter. The people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we'll have a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may," number 1, "judge us." This is verse 20. "Our king may judge us." And then number 2, "go out before us." And number 3 may go with it, but "he will fight our battles. You see that? Does that sound like a people who are depending on God? Verses 6 to 8, we see Samuel's response. This thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And so Samuel went to the Lord. Interestingly, he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they've done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." When God had rescued Israel from out of Egypt hundreds of years earlier, like we talked about yesterday when Moses led the people out of Egypt into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, you remember God spoke to them from the mountain. And in Exodus 19:4-6, God says, "Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant," what was his promise? "You will be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And what is the word holy again? It means something that is set apart to be special. It is identified as special from that which is common. That was God's plan for Israel. Different, special, dependent on God. But here, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel is in effect saying, we want to be like everyone else. Because that's where we think the answer is. We want to be like all the other nations. Where is God in that thinking? It's better for us. It's more productive for us to have a king. God also said out at Sinai that if they obey his voice and keep his covenant, he would bless them. And God gave them laws. Remember, we talked about in the books yesterday, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where those laws are given primarily. Interestingly, in those laws, there is some teaching about what would happen when Israel had a king. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. When the laws were given, they had no king. It's only here, hundreds of years later, that the people are demanding one. But notice Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 14. Read with me Deuteronomy 17 verse 14. In those laws, here God says to them, "When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children, in the midst of Israel. Notice a couple of things there in these words that were written hundreds of years before 1 Samuel. First of all, God did not say, did he, that he would ask for a king. But rather he says, when you get into the land and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations before me. There is within this law the understanding that they would demand a king at some point in the future. I don't think that here God approves of their asking for a king. But he's saying, if you do this thing that is not good, well then I'm going to tell you what you will do so that you do not cause additional sin. And that way I consider it similar to Deuteronomy 24, which gives instructions of what to do if a person divorces another and there's a divorce situation. It does not approve, I believe, of divorce. God hates divorce, Malachi chapter 2. But rather there's instruction there that if divorce happens, here's what you do to not cause additional problems, additional sin. But second, I want you to notice not only does God not approve of the king in this scripture, but here is what he says when you do have a king you must do. Number one, he must be a king that the Lord chooses. Number two, he must not be a foreigner. Number three, he must be someone that does not multiply horses. What does that mean? Why does it matter if I have horses? Well, horses were your military tools, right? So the whole idea is you don't want your kid, God does not want the king to be one that builds the horses and the building of the military power, trusting essentially in that power. He shall not multiply wives. Why not? Well, he says, they will turn his heart. They will keep him from fully serving the Lord. Nor shall he multiply silver and gold. That one might be a little more obvious. When we got multiplying of silver and gold, the danger of trusting in riches occurs. Also, he was told to write for himself a copy of all the words of the law of God in a book that he personally, now you and I take for granted that we have this book in front of us. Everybody here, you've got it on your phone, you know? Not everybody had a copy of the law for their personal use back in this day, but the king was to write a book of the law, to have it written so that he could keep it beside him, so that he could do what? Read it every day. Know every day as the king, here is what it is that the Lord God has said, so that he will not turn to the right or left, so that he will not become proud and high, so that he will be careful to observe the will of the Lord. So, what these verses are saying is that Israel, when in the future you demand a king to be like all the other nations around you, I'm telling you, you have to have a king that is not like the nations all around you. Otherwise, there's going to be tons more sin and trouble. I want you to think hard about some of the things that we see here. Horses, military power, wives, relationships, money. These are the kinds of things we turn to when we try to find the answers to problems in our lives. When a problem arises, our first thought is not often to wonder whether there's a spiritual problem at our root, a problem in our relationship with God. Our first thought is not to seek God, but instead we're tempted to think somewhere along the way, I've messed up a technique in my life somewhere. I'm not doing something right in what I'm choosing to do in my life, in and of itself outside of what God has to say. Maybe I need to learn how to say things more tactfully. That's the real problem in my life. Maybe I need to work harder. That's my real problem, and that's how I'll make more money. You know, that's how I'll provide. Right? We don't ever stop to think about the most important thing first, which is, what is it that the Lord thinks of me, and what would He have me to do? The problem with Israel in 1 Samuel 8, or what they needed to realize, I should say, is that God doesn't see as man sees. What Israel thought they saw was that they needed to have a leader, a head, a strong head that would inspire. That's the technique that they hadn't gotten right. A head that would command respect. That's what's needed to fix our problems. They asked for a king, chapter 8, verse 22, and God grants their wish. How does that turn out? Chapters 9 and 10 of 1 Samuel introduce us to Saul. That's a name you want to get familiar with, Saul. Who is a man from a good family. He's described as very handsome. He is a head taller than anyone else. It describes the amazing way in chapter 9, first half of 10, that God reveals that Saul is the one whom he has chosen to become king. This is important to see. We're not going to look at these verses in detail, chapter 9, first half of 10. But they are important to read because you see that God is the one who is acting and providing what is needed. It seems Saul has some humility and respect as he is first chosen. As you look at verse 21 of chapter 9, Saul's attitude is, I'm from the smallest family, from the smallest clan. I'm a nobody. Why should I have the kind of honor that you're speaking to me, Samuel? And that's good to see. In chapter 10, verse 17, we find the day that Samuel is going to present Saul as the new king. That God is not happy to grant, but he has chosen he will allow to grant. And Samuel gathers all the people together, and you think it's a special occasion, right? When we have special occasions, those are often the times that we don't say very hard things and challenging things. We say very nice things and flowery things. This is their new king. This is the day that he is presented to the people. Well, it says in chapter 10, verse 17, that Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, verse 18, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, and from the hand of all kingdoms, and from those who oppressed you. But you have today rejected your God, who himself saved you from all your adversities and your tribulations. And you've said to him, No, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. This is a very interesting ceremony. He's like, you remember and you know the Lord has delivered you. The Lord has done this for you, but you said set a king. So we're going to do that now. And you know those words really needed to be heard. They go through, and he brings families through, and he selects the family, and then he selects the clan, and finally he says Saul is the one that God has chosen. But Saul's not there. Everyone looks around. Where is Saul? Where is he gone? Look at verse 22. Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, Has the man come here yet? And the Lord answered, There he is, hidden among the equipment. I find that a very funny verse. Because here they are at the beginning of this time where they said, we need a king to reign over us. We're excited. And then even in this moment where the simplest of things should be to have the king ready to show, they need to ask the Lord, where's the king? Just reminds me that, yeah, you've got to depend on the Lord. Saul comes out, and as he is presented to the people, verse 24, Samuel says to all the people, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? That there's no one like him among all the people. And the people shouted, said, Long live the king. Samuel says, Look, here he is. And the people are excited. They seem to be excited because the way he looks says, this looks like a king. This is the fulfillment of our dream. We have the right technique now. We have the king that is going to do what we wish. Some people wondered in verse 27, how can this man save us? Probably because he was hiding among the equipment. They pulled him out there. There was some doubt. But he has been presented as king. Well, in chapter 11, Saul has his first chance to act. An enemy named Nahash has threatened the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan River. We're told that the Spirit of God comes upon Saul, and Saul calls all the rest of Israel to come together to fight, and they go and they have a complete victory. And there are some people who said, where are the ones who said, Saul can't save us? They need to be put to death. And Saul says, no. They will not be put to death this day. Why is that? Verse 13 of chapter 11. Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. Do you see where his heart was in this chapter? He understands, I'm the king, but it's not me. It is God who leads us. It is God who delivers us. He may have even told you on that day that the only reason I'm here as king is because God has put me here. And I have a role to play. I have a way that I need to act, and He's going to tell me what that is. But He is the one who delivers from our enemies. In chapter 12, Samuel gives a speech at a ceremony for Saul. In verse 6, Samuel says to the people, it's the Lord who raised up Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which He did to you and your fathers. When Jacob had gone into Egypt, and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. And when they forgot the Lord, their God, He sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. Then they cried out to the Lord, and said, we've sinned, because we've forsaken the Lord, and served the Baals and Ashtoreths. But now, Lord, deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. And verse 11 says, the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Bedan, Jephthah, Samuel, delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you dwelt in safety. Do you see the theme of these verses? Samuel's old. This is a big speech, and he's saying to them, let's think back through our history. You see, again and again in our history, the Lord acted and He delivered you. And when you turned from the Lord turned His hand against you. And when you cried out to Him, the Lord rescued again. And again, the emphasis is on the Lord is the one who reigns. Verse 12, he says, when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was king. Now therefore, here's the king whom you've chosen and whom you've desired, and take note, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve Him and obey His voice and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God. However, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. I'm reading all of this because I think the language is powerful. Basically what God is saying is you now have that king that you asked for. And it's kind of interesting because He doesn't say, you know, if you serve the Lord your God, then the king will do everything right and everything will be great for you. He says, if you continue to serve the Lord, then you and your king will continue following the Lord. And what those words mean is nothing has changed. You think you have put a new technique in place that will save you. But Samuel says, I'm here to tell you nothing has changed because the Lord still reigns. You can choose to follow Him. Your king can choose to follow Him. But if you don't, and if your king doesn't, it is the Lord who reigns, and His hand will be against you. Nothing has changed, really, though that they now have a king. If you think that the king is the one who delivers, you are mistaken. So we come now to chapters 13 and 14, which in my eyes stand together as one unit. And according to chapter 13 and verse 1, the events of these chapters take place about 2 years after Saul became king. I can't tell you, since the Word doesn't tell us what happened in those 2 years. The book was not intended to give a full history. He may have done some very good things. I just don't know. But this book has been clearly designed to show us what went wrong in Saul's kingship. Because by the time we get to the end of these 2 chapters, we see that Saul is not depending on God to deliver. How do we see that? Well, in chapter 13, in verses 5 and 6, the Philistines once again gather up a very large army with horses and chariots, and the number of men is like the sand on the seashore. So large an army of Philistines this is that all of Israel begins hiding in the caves and the pits and anywhere they can hide. Back in chapter 10, the very first lesson, this is the way I understand it, the very first lesson that Samuel gave to Saul about being king is that when a big challenge like this happens, verse 8 of that chapter, God wanted Saul to go to the city of Gilgal and to wait there 7 days until Samuel the prophet arrived. And there, Samuel would tell him what the message of the Lord was. That's why it was important to wait, because Saul needed to wait on the words of the Lord. And not until then should he act. So now, here in chapter 13 is such a time. It is such a challenge. And so Saul goes to Gilgal, and he waits like he was told to wait. The first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. Can you imagine this large army sitting outside ready to roll into your country, and all your people are terrified, and you're waiting and doing nothing? And you don't know what's about to happen. It's terrifying, but you know you were told to wait. It says, finally, he could wait no more. Verse 8, he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me, and he offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said, when I come, I'm going to offer the burnt offering. The 7th day was not over yet. It may have been late in the day, we're not told exactly. But Saul took it upon himself to take the offering and to offer it himself to God. Verse 10 says, now it happened, as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering, that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him. And Samuel said, actually, before I even read this next verse, I've got to imagine if Saul didn't think hard enough, he might have gone right out to Samuel and said, Samuel, you're here! So glad. Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, well, then I said, the Philistines will not come down on me at Gilgal. And I've not made supplication to the Lord. I've not worshipped him and called upon him. And therefore I felt compelled, and I offered a burnt offering. You see his idea? I've waited so long, you didn't come. It didn't look like you would come. And I thought I needed to worship God so that I could call upon him. And Samuel says to Saul in verse 13, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord's commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. How do you react to that? Doesn't Saul deserve understanding? Isn't his intentions good? If I were God, thinking back to our lesson last night, would I have punished Saul? But wait a minute. Who was Saul really depending on? Who was really the one attempting to be the deliverer? Who was really the one trying to control the situation? God had already said through Samuel, when this happens, you go, you wait the 7 days until Samuel comes. He will offer the burnt offering. He will tell you what to do. So if Saul didn't do that, who was really trying to be the controller and the deliverer? Sometimes people can convince themselves that if I just offer prayers, if I attend a church, if I take Mass or communion, if I participate in sacraments, if I worship, that God's will be bent towards me, even if I offer Him things that He never asked for, or that in fact He teaches against. I mean, this is a situation that Saul is finding himself in. Saul seemed to think in his mind that perhaps he would bend to God's will toward himself, that he would take the one who reigns and delivers and move him over to his side and even beneath him, so that now Saul was the deliverer. As I was thinking about these verses recently, it occurred to me, wait, that's just like taking the ark into the battle, isn't it? Remember the box? If we have the box here with us, we will be saved. But ritual worship that God hasn't asked for, those things don't save us. Those things don't deliver us. Only God is the deliverer. Only God can speak the means of deliverance. And Saul, in taking this action upon himself, received the consequences it's shocking, isn't it? God says your kingdom will be taken away and given to someone that really has a heart for me. In the next chapter, his son Jonathan attacks the Philistines. And in his words in verses 6 and 7 and 10, it's clear that Jonathan is dependent on the Lord for salvation. In fact, Jonathan says to the man with them in chapter 14, verse 6, let's go over to the Philistines. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. And so, as you watch what he does, he has a very successful attack on the Philistines because God works with them. And Jonathan's depending on God. Saul, we read, had something different going on. As Jonathan is attacking the Philistines and Saul is across the way watching them at a distance, and he sees that there's a lot of things going on. It says in verse 17, Saul said to the people who were with them, call the roll, see who has gone from us. And when they called the roll, surprisingly, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here. For at that time the ark of God was with the children of Israel. And you see, once again, there's that dependence on the ark showing up. Well, it says that the Lord saved Israel that day in verse 23, but the battle shifted over to another area at that same day. And verse 24 says, the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. And so none of the people tasted food. And it says that they came to some honey on the ground. They didn't eat, but Jonathan, who hadn't heard that, did eat. And then later, as they have another battle, and as there are animals there, they are taking dead animals, and finally, at the end of this day of hard fighting, they're like taking the animals and just eating them with the blood and everything, which God said not to do. Saul, I want you to realize, has done something that, you see it in movies, you see it in stories, it's real history sometimes. Saul has said, the way we're going to win this battle is to motivate my men. We're going to motivate my men by telling them, we are not going to eat until the battle is done and we have victory today. Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, unless I get my vengeance on my enemies. Sometimes people do that today, thinking that type of thing today, thinking that they're a more godly people because of it. the word asceticism. It's an English word we don't use very often, but it means practicing strict self-denial of the body as a measure of personal and especially severe discipline. Have you ever heard someone teach that if you want to learn to control the body, then make a promise not to eat food for 3 days? No, make a promise not to eat food for 5 or 10 days. Then you will learn to control your body. Or I'm going to learn to control my tongue by not speaking for an amount of time. Or I'm going to beat my body and hurt it so that I can teach myself not to do certain things. Fasting may have a place in the lives of Christians, but not for the purpose of developing self-control. Rather, as a means of humbling oneself before God as we pray. Asceticism is the idea that we can motivate ourselves properly by our own techniques in controlling the body without depending on what it is that the Lord tells us we must do to overcome the passions and desires of the flesh. Christ is the secret presented in the New Testament, right? Faith and dependence on Him, His Word, His direction, the power of Christ is the means whereby we can crucify the flesh with its passions and desires. But Saul's not listening to the Lord right now. He's saying, we need a different technique. Here's how we're going to be delivered. Jonathan had not heard the curse. He ate the honey that they found. And when he heard what happened, how his father had given that curse, look at what he says in verse 29. Jonathan says, my father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance has brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found. For now would there not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines? It's interesting to see his reaction. He says, my father made a foolish decision. He says, if you guys were able to eat, we would have had a great victory today. Now, has Jonathan changed his mind? Does he think that that is the reason they would win a battle now, as if they got a good meal that day? No. He would tell you first, the Lord has given us the victory. That's the first thing that has to be in control, but we don't have to make rules for our body. In fact, if we didn't make such rules, God might have been able to use us in a more powerful way. When Saul asked counsel of the Lord, in verse 37, he's wondering, should I go down and fight the Philistines at night? And he tried to cry out to God at this time in verse 37, but God's not answering him at this point in time because of the sinfulness. He asked counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. Saul thinks to himself, something's wrong. I'm not being answered. So Saul says in verse 38, come over here, all of you chiefs of the people, and know and see what this sin was today. Sin has happened here, he says. We need to find out what it is. As the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But not a man among all the people answered him. And he said to all Israel, you be on one side, and my son Jonathan and I will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. And Saul says to the Lord God of Israel, give a perfect lot. In other words, choose who it is that we need to give attention to. And Saul and Jonathan were chosen, but the people escaped. And Saul said, cast lots between my son Jonathan and me. And Jonathan was taken. It looks like Jonathan has been singled out. Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And Jonathan told him and said, I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand. So now I must die. And Saul answered, God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. There's an appearance here that Jonathan has been singled out by God as one that Saul needs to give attention to. And Saul is thinking sin has happened in the camp. Saul, or Jonathan, it must be you. Jonathan, what did you do? I ate the honey. You ate the honey? You have sinned. Whose law was the honey? Whose law was the rule about eating the food? Was it God's? Verse 45 says, the people said to Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. And the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Basically, the people say, Saul, you will not kill Jonathan. Look at what has happened today. Everything points to the fact that God has worked with Jonathan today. Jonathan is the one that brought the victory, that started it. God has been working with him, and we know this. Saul has what we might call false humility. He wants to look like he is a good, God-fearing man. But in fact, what he is doing is judging others based on his own rules and thinking. Saul's faith was not really in God, but in himself. It stretches further than that. As you read the end of the chapter, verses 47 to 52, we read a summary of Saul's kingship. We read how, I guess the best verse to see it's verse 52, where it says, there was fierce war with the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man or valiant man, he took him for himself. What does that mean? Anytime I find a guy who looks like the toughest guy out there, he's on my army. Where's he putting his trust and deliverance? Ritual worship, asceticism, neglect of the body, false humility. I'm reminded of words in Colossians 2, where it says in verse 20, therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations, your own rules? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but they are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. He goes on to say, if you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above. We have seen here in these chapters that God is the one who delivers us from our enemies. If you saw the title of tonight's lesson, you might have thought, the Lord delivers us from our enemies. The focus is not so much on all the deliverance that the Lord has promised to us. The focus is on, it's the Lord who gives the deliverances that we need. And Saul's problem in his kingship is he started with a humble heart and yet began to put his trust in things that were not God's things, that were not God. And ultimately it led to his ruin. He might have had good intentions in some of the things. He might have thought he was trying to be godly. But when he stepped back and take a look at what he did, those weren't God's things at all. They weren't really a trust in him. We said last night, we'll say in every one of the lessons, this book was designed the way that it was for a purpose. And this is, I think this is a major lesson that the Lord's wanting us to get out of these chapters. Is that when we put our faith in any other deliverer but God, it'll crash and burn. The Lord that we talked about last night, who is a God of knowledge and a God of power, a God of goodness and holiness, is there, and He offers deliverance. In fact, His graciousness toward Israel, even when they asked for a king to actually give them one, continue to show them mercy in a way by reigning over them still. I mean, that is the God who today calls to the world through His Son Jesus. He says, whoever believes in me shall not perish, but have everlasting life. If you believe and obey my Son. Tomorrow we're going to talk more. Well, I mean, we've covered a lot. 14 chapters in 2 lessons. We're going to slow it down a bit. Because in the first lesson tomorrow, we're only going to focus on chapter 15. And we're going to talk about how in that chapter we learn the Lord delights in our obedience. We're going to talk about how we learn that in that chapter. And then chapters 16 and 17 primarily, we're going to see the man that God has chosen next to be king. One after my own heart, God calls him. David is the one. We're going to talk about how in David we learn that God sees not as man sees. There were things that God saw in David, even as a young man, that Saul is not demonstrating. And it's those things that God sees that led God to say, this is the one. This is the one who is one after my own heart.